So we are absolutely thrilled tonight to have this all-star panel of experts here and to help answer our question, what will the Keys look like in the future? Allow me to introduce our moderator, Linda Grist Cunningham. Linda embodies the heart and soul of the Keys. Hell, she liked that one. By keeping us posted about community issues via her online news publication, Key West Island News. She uses her columns to connect residents and friends of the island, foster a one human family culture, and advance our understanding of shared island goals. She and her husband Ed and their 5 cats, affectionately referred to as the Cat Fives, live here in Key West, and we are so pleased that she has agreed to do this tonight. So thank you, Linda.
So let me tell you how we're going to do this tonight. We know people have a lot of very, very specific questions, and Last Stand has done a wonderful job of going through questions and questions and questions, and I've got a whole stack of them here, and I'm sure if you have some, you can pass a card. Bob Gold's in the back. He's got a card. Raise your hand. You can do it, and we'll try to get to them. But our format tonight is really not a ton of Q&A. What we're going to do is spend the first 30 minutes, 45 minutes, letting our panelists talk about where we are today. They'll introduce themselves, they'll talk about their areas of expertise, and talk about what the status is in their areas of expertise. Now, I hope they'll have some conversation among each other. If they don't, I'll encourage that. And we're asking each one to limit remarks to a total of 5 to 7 minutes, and I have a bell. Or I'll yell at you or something. But then we're going to take a break from sort of presentation work, and we're going to ask a lot of questions, taking your questions, the ones that Last Stand has prepared, and do a whole segment in the middle about very specific questions. And we'll wrap up with a look at the future in 2 ways. What happens if we do nothing beyond what we're doing today? And what could happen if we take the steps today, even a few of them, to preserve and protect the Keys for the future? So what I'm hoping, because I'm ever the optimist, is that as we leave here, we will leave with a feeling that we can do this, that the place we love so much can withstand all of the things that we've done to it, and that we can be here for our children and grandchildren. So with that, shall we get started? And I'm going to start in the middle. That would be you, Richard.
The question is, where are we now?
The question is, who are you and what you do? The really basic stuff, and then where are we now?
Okay. I'm Richard Grosso. I'm a lawyer. I've been working in and around the Keys since I started my law career in 1986 with the State Department of Environmental Protection, and quickly fell in love with this incredible place. And I have been a lawyer working on trying to protect the Keys pretty much every year since that time. I love the Keys so much. I married a conch, and from obviously from Key West, and we've got a lot of family down here. And I have worked in the Keys. I have visited often with family, and I feel like I have seen where we are and how we've progressed as a place that is one of the most challenging places to do land use protection and community protection and environmental protection probably anywhere else in the country. I've seen a place that has a very unique lifestyle that has spawned all sorts of art and music over the years. And I have seen a place that in many ways is certainly Key West and other parts of the Keys that are in so many of the best ways a very small town, but which experiences very big town kinds of pressures and difficulties. And I have seen the initiation of critical area designation by the state of Florida, which is incredibly unique in the state of Florida, incredibly unique anywhere in this country in terms of a state not just the local governments, but a state having essentially the final say in what happens to development because of how important the Keys as an ecosystem, as a place is to the entire state. And I have seen that evolve over the years as political attitudes change. And, just think about the push and pull that is. Pretty much everywhere else in Florida, everywhere else in the country, the city council, the county commission decides the fate of planning and zoning. So it is a politically difficult thing to do to say, no, the state's going to have that final say. And that has resulted in lots of changes in how strictly or not we were advocating and the state was doing its job on growth management. So things came to a first big head in the early 90s when, as a result of litigation we were involved in, the state put these ROGO limits in and said, we have water quality over capacity, the ecosystem is over capacity, our evacuation infrastructure is almost at capacity. They chose evacuation because that's the only thing you can really put a number on. And so that's going to be a surrogate for the bottom line forever, how much development we can have in the Keys, 24 hours, that gave us a number. And then that started to run out about 3 years ago, that amount of development. And so that was a first day of reckoning. Okay, what are we going to do now? And the state granted 1,300 new permits. We challenged that, we won, and the legislature overturned that challenge in the first bill that it passed in 2023. So I've seen the challenges and I've seen the state's reaction, but I've also, and I've been proud of the fact that so many people at the county and all the cities and at the state level have put into place this really cutting-edge, unique carrying capacity legal structure for limiting growth for all manner of valid reasons. But I also have known that ultimately that is always at the mercy of political decisions. The legislature can change that law at its will, and it did last year. When we put ROGO into place in the 90s, it was clear that you were not going to be able to let every lot in the Keys develop. We knew that. We knew there was going to be affordable housing problems. We knew there was going to be private property rights problems. We tried to deal with that through a robust land acquisition program at the state level. The state acknowledged then that it was going to have a responsibility to the extent it was essentially forcing this rate of growth on the Keys. It also had to help buy land and take off some of that takings property rights pressures, and the state knew that. We all knew that. That had to be part and parcel of the deal moving forward. We've come to another sort of important part of that, though, an important inflection point. The 1,300 new permits that were granted by the state were probably going to run out sometime maybe late 2025, maybe early 26, something like that. And so the state is already talking about what's it going to do then. And the city, certainly Marathon, has said, we want you to allow us to develop every private lot in the Keys. Monroe County, I think from the perspective of folks who, people in this audience, probably, the county's probably taken the most cautious and responsible approach. We don't really have what it takes in terms of infrastructure and everything to do that. Let's take a more guided approach, and let's only allow so much development maybe as we need to make sure we're not going to have takings, widespread takings of private property and that kind of thing. And that has yet to play out. And a big part of where we are now is that I'm getting personally some concerning signals, and I hope I'm wrong, that the state of Florida is maybe thinking it doesn't really want to be the overseer of a critical area program anymore. It doesn't really want to encourage, cajole, require the local governments to do anything they don't want to anymore. And maybe that's a way to kind of get out of the state's responsibilities to help buy land, to help fund infrastructure improvements or whatever. But that is a major turning point, I think, right now. Is the state going to abandon critical area, or is it going to step up its efforts both on the carrot and the stick side? Because the state needs to say that's got to be the growth limit, and the state needs to say we're also going to help you deal with it by funding completion of wastewater, we're almost done, and buying land and that kind of thing. So we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but I think the future is going to require some very surgical, not blanket, but surgical approaches to allowing limited additional development according to some very clear restrictions related to affordable housing and buying land and infrastructure and that sort of thing.
That was perfect.
Did I talk fast enough? Did I get it all out there? Yeah.
Rhonda, I saw you nodding your head, so if you'll take it up from there.
Start over?
Start with who you are.
All right. So Rhonda Haig, Chief Resilience Officer from Monroe County. Been here 14 years now. I was here a previous stint with Water Management District when I was with their local service center director. So I guess between the two, I've been here almost 20 years. So I wear a couple of hats at the county. One is canal restoration, where we have a list of almost 100 canals. Canals are a mess in the Keys. They weren't developed with water quality in mind. They were developed because developers use them to dig it out to build roads or houses on the side. So there's a lot of them that are too deep and winding and a lot of stagnant and very poor water quality. So we have a big water quality restoration program in Monroe County and in municipalities to help improve our water quality. So that's one hat. The other hat is, as a Chief Resilience Officer, I also do resilience programs. And so I could see what was coming. We're the canary in the coal mine as far as climate change effects from sea level rise. We all see, if you drive around here in October, November, you all see the water on the roads. And I'm astounded by the difference in just 10 years that I've seen now. It's the water on the roads in October, November is now much more widespread throughout the Keys. It's deeper and it's lasting longer. We have neighborhoods in Key Largo where it's like 1.5 feet deep for 7 or 8 weeks at a time, depending on some of the climatic conditions that John will probably talk about. But so I saw what was coming. I saw we're going to have billions of dollars in need. So what we've been doing for the last 10 years is getting all of our data out of the way to make sure that when we start getting ready to spend billions of dollars on infrastructure, that we're going to have the data behind us that's going to support all these big infrastructure projects. And believe me, they're big. So the last 3 years, we've used all that data that we've been collecting for the last decade. We've even surveyed all the roads because you have to know how high they are. And we recently completed a road elevation plan for all the county roads. And we're also working on now the municipalities, which I'll get into in just a minute. So for the 300 miles of county roads, half are going to be, are anticipated to be with some level of water on them by the year 2045. And that's 70% of our population that live on those 50% of the roads. And so when you're looking at that, we said, okay, what's it going to take to adapt these roads? Mainly it's going to be elevate. And in 2021 dollars, it was $1.8 billion. So you might as well say it's more like at least $3 billion. That doesn't include the 200 miles in the 5 municipalities that I'm helping the municipalities move forward with their street elevation planning too, so that in a year from now, when they get theirs done, we're going to walk with one voice. We have to walk with one voice in Tallahassee and in Washington, D.C. to let them know what our needs are, because they're great. I mean, we're looking at $3 billion for the county, probably another $2 billion for the municipalities, and that's just roads. That's a lot, and that's the neighborhood roads. That's not US 1, that's only neighborhood roads. So we really have to be on our toes to figure out how we're going to pay for all this. And so we've been now the last year, we've applied to the state now for 3 years in a row. We've got about $300 million. We just got awarded about 4 projects. They're big ones. One's 50 million, 40 million. Big Cop, it's like 80 million. So they're really big projects. The state only pays half. And so that really leaves a big gap in how are we going to fund these road elevation projects. And I'm learning, even if we have the money, because we're trying to get federal money to match the state grants, we have to talk to the community, because the communities all have different ideas for what they want. So there's community in Key Largo. They see the water quite frequently that's deep. They don't get mail. They don't get garbage picked up when there's water on the road. Friends won't come visit them. There's a lot of things that it affects the quality of their lives, and I understand that. So they become very frustrated, and so have other areas I'm hearing the frustration from them. It's like, come on, county, move faster. We need these road adaptations fast. Well, we can't move any faster because there's no money. The county doesn't have that kind of money in our back pockets to use as match. So we're trying to develop new sources of revenue, the second penny sales tax being one of them. But my biggest fear here is that they're starting to look at short-term projects instead of long-term resilience. When you say resilience, that means long-term. We have to be concerned here. If you want to stay here in the Keys, you're going to need to have real resilience projects that are going to last long-term. And that means the expensive road adaptation projects. And it's not just getting the water from the roads and taking it off. It's transporting it and also doing some water quality. You have to remove the garbage and stuff from the thing. So there's a water quality element to all these. But we can't sacrifice, we may have to wait till we try to get these grants and programs lined up. But if we start I hear a lot of residents now, we want the short-term project. We just want 5 or 6 inches of paving right now. Well, that's really short-sighted, and that's not going to help you in the long term to be resilient here in the Keys. So it might get us 4 or 5 years, but then what do we do? So that's really the biggest point where we are right now. If we move forward and start looking at these short-term projects, because they're not resilience projects, they're just like the put your thumb in the gap and try to keep the water for a while. That's what we really need to decide here as a community. You need to think amongst ourselves, like, are we willing to work with the county and the municipalities on these long-term resilience projects? I know Key West is going through the same vulnerability assessment, but that to me is the most important thing. If you want to be people here and have access to your homes and businesses, you're going to really need to work together and with the county and the municipalities and with our elected leaders to help make this program, these resilience program, move forward.
Yes, thank you. My name is John Rizzo, Jonathan actually. I'm the warning coordination meteorologist at the National Weather Service right here in Key West and serving all of the Florida Keys. I guess it's to say that my career in meteorology kind of began, and to avoid a completely different discussion, I'll just say a large university in the Big Bend of Florida. And after graduating in '95, good timing, there was a hiring freeze. So I was stuck at the university, and I was employed as a full-time computer programmer. But I got to work in the department, got to meet who was then going to become my first supervisor in the Weather Service, the late Bobby McDaniel. And in '99, I finally came to Key West at my first duty station here at the National Weather Service. We were at the airport back then. My main duties at the time were observations, and in other words, the observations at the airport, climate quality control, launching the weather balloons, just data collection. My career took me out west to Spokane, Washington, where I left the marine community behind, but fire weather, urban interface, forestry. As you can imagine, wherever there's inhabitation, the suburbs get further and further out from the city core, and they live in areas that have a higher risk. And so I got to see how important that program was to them, because at the end of the game, they have their own hurricane, wildfire, urban wildfire is a big danger. And so I had an opportunity in 2002 to come back to Key West to become the warning coordination meteorologist. And thankfully, the late Matt Strahan actually hired me. And I now had a new role to be the head of public outreach and education in meteorological science, as well as the liaison between our office and hazardous weather, as well as risk acknowledgement with emergency management, which was our #1 partner back then. Since that time, our partnership has expanded all across. We work very closely with the military, the Navy, the U.S. Coast Guard sector, and as well as get beyond emergency management to various departments, first responders, et cetera, because weather is at all scales. It's the thunderstorm that might strike 5 minutes from now, all the way to climate prediction. Now, how my role shifted from the forecast of short-term weather into climate kind of started around 2010. When someone named Allison Higgins brought me on board to discuss sea level rise. And it was held at Old Town Hall. And we were facing a period of higher than usual tides in late May due to chronic low pressure systems getting stuck off east, toward Bermuda, which was causing this fetch of northeast near gale winds. And later a paper came out from NOAA saying that that can cause the Gulf Stream to temporarily slow down and become less efficient. So if the water can't exit the Straits of Florida, it starts piling up to the rate of about one full Lake Okeechobee every 48 minutes. That's how much the slowdown was actually causing. So it caused the tides to rise. They were about 14, 15 inches higher than the astronomical prediction. And what a great place to hold it. Because if you've ever been on Ann Street and Front Street and Green Street in that area, that was a good place to demonstrate spring tide when we're stumbling to get into the side door to have our meeting. Over since that time, I was presenting data that showed that the linear rate of rise, it's a solid data set, goes back to 1913 here in Key West Harbor, showed that the linear rate was maybe about 8.7, 8.8 inches per century. Well, a few years after that, the new tidal epoch, a 19-year period of record of the moon's movements, the moon's orbit is not perfectly over the same part. It's kind of like a hula hoop. It wobbles a little bit, and then one part is closer to the Earth than the other part of its orbit. All those things calculated throughout 19 years, then you can get a good impression on what sea level really is. They published that new epoch shortly after that, and I noticed the 100-year rate was closer to 10 inches. Wait a minute, a long-term linear rate changes? The actual 95% confidence interval was about a half an inch. So how do we move it an inch? Well, that's because the rate of rise is not linear. And that has explained another curiosity, because Vakhiki, which had more of a 50-year tidal record, had a 100-year rate that was more like a foot, every century. That's now actually exceeding 14 inches now. And the reason for that is because the record is shorter and you're watching a later part of the curve. So the rate is not linear. It is rising. And in fact, if you look at the last 50 years or so, the rate of rise in Key West itself is actually over 10 inches, between 10 and 11 inches per 100 years. So that just tells you that the rate of rise is increasing. So what that means in terms of operations is now little things mean a lot, not just the king tides of the autumn season, which are seasonal, but weather events such as tropical storms. You get 6 hours of 40 to 50 mile an hour winds, and now the water's getting into homes. It's covering streets. Well, some of those same storms wouldn't have done that 30 years ago. I also look at the big storms. Everyone likes to focus on the Cat 5 hurricanes and rapid intensification, and I'll touch on that for about a minute. But the actual thing is that imagine all the stories you've heard from Hurricane Wilma in 2005 or Irma. If the water was about this much higher, it would be in my house. Well, that's where we're heading. We're heading in that direction. So finally, the hurricane part. Obviously, I brief emergency management and decision makers. Decisions are made. That job is getting extended earlier in time. The reason I cannot speak on behalf of emergency management, but I am aware as a resident, especially since 1999, that there is a phasing to the evacuation. We carve out who's a resident, who's not a resident, what are they living in, a boat, a mobile home, etc. Workforce housing, and we draw a new line. This is why the emergency management asks me at earlier times for information that I am not as certain about. We have made great advances in terms of track forecasting. The day 3 forecast, 72-hour forecast, is better than the day 1 forecast was back in 1990. However, if emergency management needs information to make go, no-go decisions at earlier and earlier time steps, you lose the advantage of having those more accurate forecasts. And then finally, rapid intensification. Obviously, over time, as the waters get warmer, the waters are always warm. The Caribbean and the streets of Florida are always open for business in the traditional hurricane season. But storms that form east of the islands now have a longer season. The water is getting warmer earlier. It's staying warmer later. And then when you have things like El Niños, such as what we're in right now, when you have non-tropical systems in the Gulf, well, if the water is warmer in the Northwest Caribbean, it gives it a better source, and you get these, what we call these hybrid storms. They're locally a lot more intense. And as we've learned, in the last couple storms in the late fall there, they too have surge with them. So.
Thank you, Linda. Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Berg, and I'm the Field Program Director with the Nature Conservancy, based out of my home office on Big Pine Key. But before that, I grew up here in town. Got some great memories of riding by on my bicycle, probably going to and fro the library and hearing the church choir singing in here, but I've never been in the building. It's really beautiful. Great to have an invitation. So I'm going to focus on the sort of natural habitats and native species side of things. And it's a good news, bad news story. On the terrestrial side, I'll focus terrestrial and a bit on marine, although you'll certainly hear more from Dr. LaPointe on the marine. So all the efforts over all the years on the terrestrial side, preventing the hunting of the key deer, buying land to protect the habitat, managing the habitat with things like prescribed burning and invasive species control, wetland restoration, all the law enforcement, education and outreach efforts, and so on, have essentially saved most of these rare species from extinction. The key deer are doing very well right now. Not all of the rare species are doing that well, but we basically stopped the hemorrhaging. We saved these species, but now as a result of sea level rise, that win is going to be taken away from us. There's only so much land, it only has so much elevation, and as you just heard, it's rising faster and faster. I don't have the detailed numbers that John Rizzo does, but prior to that last 100-year record that he was talking about, for about 3,000 years, the sea only rose at a rate of about 1 inch per century. And as you just heard, it's roughly a foot per century now across the Keys over the last century. And the projections from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration today suggest that we should be looking for at least or about another foot between now and 2050. Now and 2050, another foot. You know, my house is at 5 feet above sea level. You probably all know what your elevations are. I know my mother's elevation, hi, Mom, about 3 feet, not high enough. And then between now and 2100, look for 4 feet or more. We do not have a lot of margin for error. Sea level is going to take the terrestrial conservation wins that we all worked so hard for, Last Stand and others, away from us. So what are we going to do about it? I'll talk about that more later. The marine side, that was the good news. The marine side, you know, if you've been diving, fishing, boating down here as long as I have, you've seen a lot of degradation. There have been valiant efforts, equally valiant to what we've done on the land, the big we, the public agencies, the conservation organizations, academic science individuals, the establishment of the marine protected areas like the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, the establishment and management of the national parks, et cetera. Huge, expensive billion-dollar efforts to sewer the Florida Keys so we're not allowing our local nutrient pollution to get into the ocean have helped, but they have not been nearly enough to counteract the very strong, very negative consequences of climate change, which takes the form of rising temperature in the water, more acidic water, rising sea level, and stronger storms, all of which take a toll on our marine ecosystems. On the other side of that coin, you know, it's still a great place to fish and dive and boat. And so from the economic perspective, people think it's great. It's, you know, it doesn't matter when you came down here, everybody has that baseline. It's like it was when I got here, and it's gotten worse since then, but it's still good enough. And it's still good enough to support massive economic and you know, human uses. Diving industry, fishing industry, boating industry are super strong, and they will probably continue to be strong even as our resources continue to decline. And there are things that we can and should do. We'll talk about the positive opportunities, but we're in bad shape on the marine side. And who better to follow me?
All right. Well, thank you and good evening, everyone. It's great to be here at Williams Hall. And yeah, I am Brian LaPointe. I moved to the Florida Keys, to Big Pine Key back in 1982. So I've got to see firsthand what's happened in the marine environment over my career and document the changes that we have all seen. My initial work was in Pine Channel, where I was dosing populations of sargassum, right? The newest kid on the block for algae blooms, to see how we could make it grow faster, right? This was a biofuel project. during the Jimmy Carter days, the efforts and funding that were being put towards alternative fuels. The idea was to take our wastewater and grow these big algae farms and then anaerobically digest the algae to make methane. And and unfortunately, I think, when Ronald Reagan was elected, remember he took the solar panels off the White House, and that was kind of the end of that program. But anyway, we learned a lot about nutrients in those early years. We saw how the nitrogen was going up in the water during the wet season to fairly high levels. And I'm thinking, I started looking around and I noticed Port Pine Heights, where I live, and Little Torch Key, with homes, about 4 homes with septic tanks per acre, 4 or 5. And I thought, gosh, how are these septic tanks supposed to work in this environment? And that led to a collaboration with Monroe County around 1985, funded by the state of Florida Coastal Zone Management Program. One of the first septic tank studies in Florida, where we began to see where that nitrogen was coming from. And through our research, we've refined it using stable nitrogen isotopes, where we can compare the source of the nitrogen, whether it's fertilizer or human waste nitrogen. And we're using that right now up in the Indian River Lagoon. There was a lot of wishful thinking it was all coming from fertilizers, and we'll just have fertilizer ordinances in the wet season and cut it off. But they have 300,000 septic tanks up there. So the fertilizer ordinances were not enough, and they are about to embark on the project we did here in the Florida Keys with improving their wastewater infrastructure. And so those studies in the 1980s expanded from our cultures in Pine Channel all the way out to Looe Key, where I started a long-term water quality monitoring program. It's the longest low-level nutrient water quality monitoring in the world. We've been able to show the change over time as climate has changed, as human population, the human nitrogen footprint has expanded, not just here in the Keys, but on the mainland. We have seen the reactive nitrogen double from the 1980s to the 1990s. The chlorophyll A, the greening of the waters, doubled, okay? And as we have all seen, that has not been good for the corals. They have declined because of the stresses directly from the nutrients stressing the corals, the effects of nitrogen suppressing growth rate in the corals, but also increasing turbidity and chlorophyll in the water that reduces light that they need. So it was, I guess, around the mid-90s when this was really getting bad. We were seeing more water from the mainland coming from the Everglades and really all of the southwest Florida coast coming down. Those currents carry it down into the Florida Bay, Florida Keys area. But we knew we could do something locally, and that was with the wastewater. And that's when I ran into my colleague, Richard Grosso over here. And this was the stretch case that ended up being really the key moment that led to the sewering of the Florida Keys, including advanced waste treatment and deep well injection in some areas, but not all. And so I gotta just say, this was a huge lift for this county. And I just want to congratulate the city of Key West and the county for undertaking what is just an amazing job. Now, there is more work to do. We're working on shallow wells up and down the Keys. Many of those remain. We know they're not working in the Florida Keys. And there are other things we can do. Obviously, packaged treatment plants that aren't achieving advanced waste treatment. There's probably a lot more septic tanks that remain to be hooked up to the wastewater treatment system. and other things that we can do to improve water quality as well. Maybe some fertilizer ordinances. We're finding in Florida lakes that they work actually better in the dry season than the wet season. And the wet season is when you want to have really well-nourished turfs on your lawn or whatever to absorb the stormwater runoff. So that science is emerging. And by the way, as you know, Florida's population has grown, 1,000 people a day are moving to Florida. So we're seeing more and more human waste. And through our isotope sampling and through the use of sucralose, the artificial sweetener, which we used in the Marathon case just recently to demonstrate the upward buoyant flow from the injectate of that shallow well, we are finally convincing people that, yeah, this has more to do with human waste than fertilizers, what's happening in the Indian River Lagoon, other places, even Lake Okeechobee, the Kissimmee Basin, we're seeing more and more human nitrogen coming from Orlando south into the lake, feeding those blue-green algae blooms. So I am these days working up on the mainland trying to clean that up because that water does end up down here. There's a lot of work to be done up there. And I just want to say we need to keep monitoring. That's how we know we're going to go through this period of recovery from the great infrastructure improvements we've made here. We got to keep monitoring and be vigilant about all these other projects that need to be done.
Crikey, I love science. I mean, this is really great. One of the takeaways from 5 panelists, these people have committed their entire careers to doing this work. And in a culture where we want things to happen today, if not quicker, it's hard, I suspect, to stay focused on what I do today will have an impact tomorrow and all. So I am grateful for what you do. Okay, let's go to some questions. Oh, well, you just answered that one. Chris, you depressed me. All this work I have building my little urban hammock on my property here in the middle of Key West and sea level rise at another foot. Before I sell the house, it'll drown, right? Is there anything I can do?
Yes, but we all need to do something. And I mean the big all, because this is driven by global climate change. When you hear reduce your fossil fuel emissions, turn off the lights when you're not in the room, get the hybrid car or the electric car, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Reducing contributions of greenhouse gas emissions, switching to alternative energy, reducing deforestation and forest degradation, those are fundamentally the things that cause greenhouse gas emissions, that cause global climate change, that lead to things like sea level rise, stronger storms, all the bad things. So those are things that individuals can do, and you can encourage your local, state, and federal government policymakers to do. We have to work at every level. And we need to be realistic. We need to adapt. So if you're building soil, you're building your elevation, that's a very, at your scale, a reasonable thing to do. I'm doing it at my property on Big Pine Key. Eventually, though, you can only raise the road so many times before you need to make, tough decisions about cost to benefit, what does it buy you, how much time does it buy you. When it's time for us to go, we need to be thinking about the future marine environment that will be here eventually, and dealing with our legacy of pollution before it becomes marine pollution. I'm probably not helping, am I, Linda?
No.
I guess
that's okay.
I've grappled with this for a long time, and these are my ways of being positive about it. There are things we can do.
Well, I look at it this way. We started with a lignum vitae seedling about this high in a little tiny pot. It's now in a bigger pot, and it's about 5 feet high. And 20 years from now, I think it'll still be above sea level, and it'll be a big tree in my front yard that nobody can take down. Okay. Richard, let's go back to the carrying capacity issues and the suggestion, I'll put it that way, that we should go from 24 hours to 31 hours for evacuation time. Do we need a new study on carrying capacity? What needs to happen to get us out of the Keys safely? And I'll let John piggyback on that one too.
The state just redid the models and looked at different scenarios, and the numbers were the minimum evacuation time is most realistically like 26 already, and the maximum evacuation time, if we let everything develop that's a private lot, would be, I believe, 36. And the 24-hour was not some sort of arbitrary thing. It's my understanding that that was what the National Hurricane Center had told the state back then, and I'd like to hear where the thinking is now, that that was the maximum safe evacuation time. If you're counting on having more time than that, you shouldn't count on that. So they redid the numbers. Those numbers probably aren't going to change a whole hell of a lot. You're not going to add a lot of lanes to US 1. We just don't have the physical capacity to increase the ability to get more cars out a lot. All of this stuff is public policy decisions by the legislature. They can decide we're going to respect what the scientists tell us and keep it at 24 hours, or they can decide that the totality of issues, public safety, affordable housing, economic activity, means we're going to have to take some risks. And that's the big question. How much risk are policymakers in the legislature and the city councils and county commission going to be willing to take? Are we going to jack that number up to 26 hours of school, 28, 30, 36? That's the big question on the table right now. I think, having been essentially the lawyer for the environmental community in the Keys, for lack of anybody else, it's me, sorry, for all these times, I don't in my wildest dreams believe we are going to say this is it. We're cut off, there's not going to be any more development. I think we need to keep that number as low as we possibly can. We are going to have to increase the robustness of land acquisition programs to buy land that's not going to be buildable under ROGO. We are going to have to finally make that decision. Last Stand and other groups have been arguing for years. To the extent you have to allow more development, it can't be for second and third homes, for wealthy lawyers from Fort Lauderdale. We don't have a market rate housing problem in the Keys. We have an affordable housing problem. But our arguments over the last 30 years to make 80% of the ROGO units go to affordable housing and only 20 to market rate, there's never been a political appetite for that. That needs to change. The minimum amount of new development we're going to have to allow in the Keys, in my view, needs to be overwhelmingly set aside for true affordable housing, enforceable into the long term, and units that the county and the cities have no choice but to approve to avoid the taking of private property. And the other thing that we need to do with any new growth that we allocate in the Keys, in my opinion, is tie them to the same kind of work plans we used to tie them to over the first 10 years of ROGO, meaning things like, you want to get next year's allocations, we have to meet X goal for buying land. You want to meet next year's allocations, you have to meet this goal for finishing the unsewered projects that we still haven't done yet, doing the deep well in Marathon. The detail things, we don't have any room anymore for generalized, across the board solutions. Every ROGO unit decision for every piece of land has to be the perfect decision, surgical solutions. So it has to be that kind of thing. Vacation rentals, when we did the last ROGO litigation, through depositions and documents we read, the planners for the cities and the counties were being pretty candid. ROGO is maybe 4th or 5th on the list of problems for affordable housing. Vacation rentals are maybe at the top. The cost of construction are big up there, and that kind of thing. So, you know, we are an area of critical state concern. Why can't the legislature exempt the Keys local governments from the prohibition on regulating vacation rentals? We are losing so much existing built housing stock to vacation rentals, that kind of thing. So it's got to be all hands on deck, every possible solution available to us to avoid takings liability by lot aggregation, which the courts allow us to do, for example, and everything has to be affordable or beneficial use. That's what it's going to have to be. We're going to have to buy up and preserve as much of the upland remaining habitat as we possibly can, and make sure that any new development is going into truly scarified lots that really don't have, all things being considered, a major environmental impact.
Thank you. John, will you?
To first speak to that, when we were dealing with the 24-hour timeline, yes, before I got into the Weather Service, and right by the time of 1990, there was a long-standing policy that a hurricane warning meant hurricane conditions expected within 24 hours. That was simply it. And likewise, a tropical storm warning was the same thing. Tropical storm conditions expected within 24 hours. The watches were issued 12 hours earlier than that, and that just said you were in an area that had a potential. Well, over the years, they've now refined that to 36 hours, but a very important piece of information is in the definition of a hurricane warning. It means that hurricane conditions are expected somewhere within the warning area, and that the 36-hour timeline was to the arrival of tropical storm force winds. Why is that important? Because that's when folks need to be off the road. And that is a very important piece of information that was missing in the old hurricane warning. So when the hurricane warning is issued, under a perfect scenario, and that a forecast of a storm coming in, that's what that means, is that you're at the 36-hour mark right there. The watch at best is issued 48 hours in advance, but it lacks the confidence. And so when I look at these, and 2 points that you brought up, well, one is, if the resident population, of course we have seasonal residents too that are counted perhaps in the census, but may not be present, but you have this large population load. There's obviously a lot more folks in my time as a resident of Key West that are here during the so-called off-season. I don't think there is an off-season, it seems, anymore. But those are the folks that are at the early part of the timeline, that emergency management and the Joint Command has to make a decision on this is the time to evacuate. And they have to make that decision to get most of those people out very early on. And the residents are at the back end, but then again, who's a resident? You see, in my world, when I'm trying to talk to someone that may be at risk for a hurricane, I'm not separating the mobile home resident as some other individual. They're a resident. A liveaboard is a resident. And they have great big timelines. And not just the residents, the businesses that support that. I don't know exactly how long it takes to prepare a marina, but I know it's not 24 hours. And all that has to be done in advance. And then finally, the workforce portion. When we're communicating weather watches and warnings, we're talking to the folks at that grocery store, or first responders, and the home improvement store, and they're integral part on how we prepare. But and TSA, I'm going to bring it up, the airport. When do they have to leave based on their policies of being in an area under threat? They're all part of the equation. And they each have different thresholds that they pick to decide when to stay or go. And then you have storms like Irma, where the greatest exodus in vehicles from the Keys, just vehicles, I'm not going to imply that they were residents versus someone else, was on the Tuesday before the storm. And everyone knows what Florida looked like the days following when everybody else was evacuating. But that all goes into the equation. All I see is where we're going is that folks, that decision makers are going to be asking earlier and earlier for, is this potentially a Category 3? Is this a candidate for rapid intensification? And it's going to happen at timescales that are succeeding where we are with the science in improving those type of forecasts.
Not to mention the fact that every one of us in here is sitting here listening to those forecasts and going, I'm not going.
Linda, could I jump in on carrying
Yes,
capacity?
by
And
all
this is a
means.
different twist. You just heard the growth management perspective, the hurricane evacuation perspective, and another is the sort of natural resource use perspective. So we've got in the backcountry of the lower Florida Keys here, we've got spots where people go out and hang out on their boats. Snipe Point, anybody ever been to Snipe Point? Marvin Key, et cetera, et cetera? Me too. I see more and more and more people there. That's okay. Those places are the traditional places that people go. The numbers are large, the impacts are significant. The problem is that every other sandbar between every other island is now also that same kind of party spot. There are no sandbars left on the weekend for the birds and for the fish and for the fishermen who want to target fish in quiet places. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's going rapidly in that direction. Out at the coral reef, where we've got our sanctuary preservation areas, mooring buoys, those were made sanctuary preservation areas because they were already popular, but they have gotten more and more and more popular, more and more people using them. But as you have heard, there are not more and more local residents in the Florida Keys. There are generally fewer of us. So it's visitors. And I'm not anti-tourism. I've worked in the tourism industry, selling dive trips and teaching people how to sail and renting motor scooters and all the good stuff. But more and more people using these very small areas have an impact. And we do not at present, the natural resource management agencies don't have, whether it's the will or the constituency, to push them to manage carrying capacity of recreational use in these places.
Rhonda? You referred to the little steps, and I know the neighborhood you're talking about wants some pavement put in. How do you convince the population, individually and collectively, that we can't spend money on little projects when such big ones are necessary? Okay, good luck.
So that's the big question, because that neighborhood is asking, and I get it, because they want their mail, they want their garbage, and they think it's $40 million for that road elevation project in that neighborhood. In Key Largo, it serves about 200 homes. $40 million is a lot of money. They don't think we're ever going to get it. And so they kind of give up hope. They say, we need something now because our cars are rusting out, people won't come visit, and so I get it. There's no, number one, it's not a resilience project. It's a short-term Band-Aid. There's no grants. They're going to pay for that, ever, because they're not resilient. So now the county has, if we do move forward with that, the county's going to have to dig up that money from somewhere, and it's going to be all local funds paying for it. There's no grant funds that are going to pay for that. Now, the big long-term resilience projects, the $40 million project for that neighborhood, there are grants that will pay for it. In fact, we have a grant already for the design of that particular neighborhood road elevation project. It's been underway for a year from the state. They're paying the design. Now, if we go ahead and apply, when we get the design done, we can apply for construction, and we'd probably have a step up. We would probably get that grant, but again, it only funds half. So that's why we have to be really creative. Well, how are we going to fund these other projects? The county doesn't have unlimited bonding capacity. We can't go borrow $1 billion or $2 billion. It has to come from somewhere. So we're trying to, these are new programs. The resilience program hasn't been here around. So we're trying to figure out new sources of revenue, because the residents certainly can't afford to pay all that themselves. You're going to pay those, if those 200 residents in that neighborhood had to pay a $40 million or $20 million match, it's not going to happen. So we have to look at other revenues, and that's why the county is looking at that second penny sales tax and the charter referendum things to develop new sources of revenue, because that's largely funded by the tourists. So residents do pay some, but the majority is funded by residents. So if we don't come up with some kind of sources of revenue to help fund these projects, even the match, you're gonna see you're going to see that like what that neighborhood sees now. 2-3 months of the year, and it won't be that long where it'll be year-round, because sea level rises another foot in the next 20 years. That's a lot of water coming. So if we don't all work together now to figure out how we're going to catch up on these resilience projects, they're going to be part-time neighborhoods. You're not going to be able to live there, or you're not going to be able to have access to your home the way you want access. It's not going to be dry. You might be driving through 6 inches or 12 inches, kind of. I've learned a lot from him. He's my mentor. I figured out why is this neighborhood flooding so heavily in the king tides? It's because a lot of the stuff also, it's not just sea level rise, it's what's going on out in the bay, pushing all that water in, and then it can't get out. So we got to really figure out, and the neighborhoods have to figure out themselves, are we in it for the long run? You want your kids and grandkids? Are you interested in the Keys being really resilient and be able to be here for a long time? Because if you're not, then it's going to be Band-Aid fixes, and it's going to be much, much shorter in a lot of these neighborhoods. And we haven't even talked retreat in the Keys because nobody's willing to do that. There might be neighborhoods that, if we're not going to do long-term resilience, then we're definitely going to have to talk retreat.
That's a big word to hear.
Yeah.
And first, I have to admire the shirt.
Yeah.
And then I have to tell you, you just tell the story about the shirt, and then I have a question.
Yeah, so this is the first time I've worn this shirt in public, okay? And it was made by, the company's called Something's Fishy on Big Pine Key. A lady that sells these custom handmade shirts at the Boondocks Flea on Saturday mornings. And I've got 5 or 6 of her shirts. They're beautiful shirts, but this is my favorite. She told me she found the fabric and I don't know why this.
There you go.
All right, this is the good mic. Anyway, this is what our coral reefs used to look like, okay? Elkhorn coral all over it, all kinds of biodiversity that many of you who are here back in the 60s, 70s, and even up to the 80s, you will recognize a lot of the organisms on this shirt.
That probably is the best marketing for taking care of the reef that we could have. So here's the question, and I'm going to pull it down. Is it safe to eat the fish?
Well, there have been a number of studies in recent years showing a number of pharmaceuticals that are showing up in fish tissue. So buyer beware, right? I know there's a study that was recently done by the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust. Their paper is in review now, I believe, but it's going to show that right here, in Florida Bay, the Florida Keys region, there are a lot of pharmaceuticals. I think they measured up to 60, 70 different types of pharmaceuticals.
So as a plug for the recycling program, please don't put your medications in the trash. Please take them to the monthly pick up your drugs thing. That, you know what I meant. Mm-hmm. All right. We're done with these questions because it's getting hot in here and you're ready to go home because we're all old and we go to bed by 8:30. So, well, look around. Come on. So here's how I'd like for the panel to end things. And we'll just start with Chris and move through to Brian. You've already told us, so you can't do it again. You've already told us if we keep doing what we're doing, we are really up that creek without no paddle, all right? So let's just say, and you can incorporate this in 2 ways. If we do the right things, even if we do some of or most of the right things, what could it look like 10 to 20 years out? And if you had $1 billion to invest in your area of expertise, what would you use it for to improve that future?
Well, $1 billion.
Yeah.
Well, I described the situation we're in. It's a tough situation, global challenges, regional water quality challenges, local challenges, but we've made a lot of progress. We need to stay the course on a lot of these things. We need to focus on the climate issue at every level. We need to continue on our local water quality, our regional water quality. I mean, that extends to the Mississippi River and the Caribbean Basin, and again, big issues. But then there are the local things. I talked about heavy use of our marine spaces and our natural resources. And I'm not proposing that we don't use them. I'm proposing that we use them sensitively. We base out our use. We take the lightest approach that we can. Don't touch the coral, don't dump your junk in the water. You know, all those little things really do add up. They make it a nicer place to visit. They make it a nicer place to live in. They make it healthier for the marine life, and so on and so forth. $1 billion. That's a tough one, because you heard about what it costs to raise a couple of roads. Yeah, oh, she can spend it. You know, that's so tough. That is so tough. Education and outreach. People outside of this choir, you're the choir. If you're a member or want to be a member of Last Stand, everybody needs to get it, and everybody needs to take action.
Very good. All right. So when you heard me talking about resilience in our road adaptation program and other resilience, so it's not just make everything resilient, because that's not economical. There's a lot of water coming, 4 feet, 5 feet by the year 2100. No matter what we do, we can't spend enough money to keep everything above water and dry. So the thing we want to do in the next 10 years, because you heard me talk how much money it's going to be, $3 billion for the county, probably another $2 billion for the municipalities, and that's just roads, that's nothing else. So if I had $1 billion, I would look at our vulnerability program and say, okay, where's this money best spent? Should there be some neighborhoods, maybe that's not worth spending for whatever reason? They're already really low and they're going to be inundated anyway. Should we be spending $50 million on a neighborhood or $100 million? One of the county roads is Flagler Avenue here. That's like, I think, an $80 million cost estimate, but there's a lot of people on that road. And so that's in our plan. That's really high up in our plan. So I would, when $1 billion, I could spend it like that. But, I would try to do careful resilience planning, and so that your dollars are best spent, because we're never going to have enough money to do all the resilience infrastructure building construction that we need to do. So we have to do what we can do wisely, make sure that it follows the environmental program and that we have living shorelines as much as we can. It's not all hard infrastructure. Make sure we build a water quality element into it. We have to anyway. And just be careful as you move forward, and keep the neighborhoods invited and engage them, because they have their own ideas and they don't always match what we think should be done. And so you need to listen to them too. And if a neighborhood wants a short-term solution, well, then we got to look at that. But they have to understand, if they get a short-term solution, that might be all they get. They might not get a longer-term one, because there's so many other projects to spend money on that we're not going to have enough. So really, they need to be careful what they want for long-term resilience in the Keys.
Good point.
I would focus the money and effort in the following ways. A really conservative United States Supreme Court in a Florida case a few years ago was very clear: no private property owner is entitled to any subsidy whatsoever. The problem is, we live in Florida. We have subsidized the ruination of our state through low taxes, through federally subsidized flood insurance, through all manner of different ways. You first need to have an ethic, I think, that priority right now in the Florida Keys is to preserve and protect the existing people and existing investments instead of luring more down here into harm's way. I think that's the first thing that you have to do. And you're going to need to work at all the levels, federal, state, and local, of governance. FEMA provides federal flood insurance at artificially low rates. And they have a responsibility here to consult again the effort in terms of to what extent are they fueling increased climate problems, sea level rise, and habitat loss, and water quality degradation in the Florida Keys. You've got an administration at the federal level right now that is making monies available for long-term sustainability. We don't know how long that will be, the administration, and move quickly to take advantage of federal programs and federal agencies who understand the need for long-term resilience. Money is the answer to most things. it's got to be an all hands on deck thing. Why was I able to drive down here and not pay a toll? Was a $5 toll going to stop me or anybody from coming down here to spend a lot of money in the Keys? We need to be letting tourists and day trippers really pay for their own impact in the Florida Keys. And every dollar spent buying a lot off of the development rolls is a dollar you don't have to spend raising its roads and cleaning up after a hurricane and the other things. We don't talk a lot about the public burdens, but in many ways, every new house, to be honest about it, is in some ways a fiscal liability for that local government. We are struggling to allow people to build on lots that have already been platted in single ownership in the Keys. One thing that needs to be off the table yesterday is any up planning, any up zoning. There's no way in the world when you've got private property rights problems already with existing development rights that the county or any of the municipalities should be granting any increase in development to anybody. Right?
Okay, let's let John.
I got my mic. I brought my own. Just kidding. Well, just taking a look. I mean, unfortunately, I got the worst news in trying to look ahead 10 years into the future because, as you know, there's a lot of uncertainty with climate modeling down the road. In fact, when you see these curves, I'm not sure if they were going above our head or not, but you've heard that. What is intermediate? What is intermediate high? Well, they're actually like broad bands, and they overlap, and it's based on the fact that there are 4 components, to trying to predict the climate of the future. And sadly, I won't remember all of them, but there's uncertainty in weather and how global weather connections actually occur. There's uncertainty in what the humans are going to do. Obviously, it's not just what we do, but as Chris had said, the whole world has to do. And basically, the range is everybody just stops. In other words, no human-made carbon input anywhere across the world, and they did it tomorrow. There's still about a 30 or 40-year lag with that. The sea level will keep rising, and will keep going. But then after that, you'll start to see, some leveling off and differences. But in terms of, so I don't have much to say. The seawater has risen about 1 in, I would say, 3/8 of an inch since I stepped through those puddles on Ann Street back in 2010. And by 2034, it'll be at least an inch higher, maybe an inch to an inch and a quarter than it is. And that will be the sea level here in Key West. But as far as, if we had $1 billion, which is about the budget of the National Weather Service of everybody, as well as the development of a new geostationary satellite, that's about $1 billion project. But for me, I'm leaning closer to the satellite, and that is because observations. Nothing beats getting ground truth or water truth data. And here I am standing before you. I don't have a good feeling on where we are with budget and observations. Weather Service observations portfolio is not growing. And that is why we're losing some of the, what we call the seaman stations out on the reef. They're on old, aging structures, the historic lighthouses, and they're not appropriate, to host that kind of equipment. What I'd like to see with money, whether it's given to me or it's provided through grants in organizations, NGOs, is that we look to expanding both our oceanographic and atmospheric monitoring. Our tsunami network, which was started back after 2004, buoys that are good at detection of tsunami, but we don't have anything above the water that is checking things oceanographic or in the atmosphere. Missed opportunity. It was too narrow a project. And likewise, we need to make sure that everything's integrated. We understand the ocean, the sea, and that gives more data for everyone to use into the future.
Thank you.
Great. Well, $1 billion. I think that's about what our wastewater infrastructure upgrade costs, right? So mine has already been spent, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to go back to Richard's suggestion about the tolls, okay? And let's take that money, okay, and pay to convert these shallow wells to deep wells and all the other wastewater infrastructure operation and maintenance that is going to have to continue to keep our waters clean here in the Florida Keys. I think that's a great source of funding because it's those tourists that are coming down flushing those toilets and contributing to this problem. So they really need to pay their fair share. And beyond that, I would say if I could have another $1 billion, I would really like to get an education program. People really need to know these issues that are global in nature, but they have local solutions. And nitrogen, as I mentioned, it doubled from the 80s to the 90s. At Lou Key, we use that evidence to help get the new infrastructure in place, because we knew just in Monroe County locally, 1 million pounds of nitrogen a year from our waste, okay? Shark Slough in a big flood year, 2 to 3 times that much. That's going down to the backcountry, Chris, okay? That's those blooms we see coming down through the backcountry are being fed by mainland runoff from Everglades and on up. So nitrogen, as it turns out, is the biggest human change on our planet. The increased nitrogen, we've doubled it on the planet, just like we saw here. And that is linked to the reduction of biodiversity on our planet. So I would like to take that next $1 billion and start marching up to the mainland and cleaning up our watershed that goes all the way up to Orlando. Because over the next 10 years, with climate change, which is going to, even if we held it level, the amount of nitrogen in Monroe County, climate change alone from extreme rainfall events is going to increase it by 20%. The amount of nitrogen loading, fueling the harmful algal blooms. And we're seeing all of them all around Florida, blue-green algae, brown tides, red tides. We saw it last summer here, affected the tourists during mini season. So maybe they'd pony up some money, right, to clear up the waters.
Thank you, Brian. All 5 of these folks appear in various speaker series throughout the Keys and throughout Key West. So keep your eye on the calendar of events, because if you go to a speaker series, you get to hear them for like 90 minutes, one person. And so you get all your questions to ask, and it works really well. These are 5 magnificent experts. Please thank them for the information and for putting up with all of us tonight. Thank you very much, guys.